Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful, real-life narratives that inspire, challenge, and move us. Today, we bring you the story of Marcus Johnson, a Black FBI director who faces a brutal battle against systemic corruption and personal betrayal. In his fight for justice, Marcus encounters unimaginable challenges that test his courage, his integrity, and his love for his family. Join us as we dive deep into his journey, a story of resilience, sacrifice, and unwavering determination. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's story. Marcus Johnson, a man of dignity and strength, had long learned to keep his composure in the face of adversity. At 43, he stood tall, a Black man who had climbed the ranks of the FBI with relentless perseverance and integrity. As the director of the Houston branch, Marcus was no stranger to the dangers of the world around him, or the weight of the responsibility his title carried. But on that evening, as he drove his silver sedan along Route 60, something unexpected and unjust was about to unfold. The air was thick with the dry heat of the Arizona desert, the sun having just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a bruised purple sky. Marcus, tired after months of hard work dismantling a cartel smuggling ring, was looking forward to a rare weekend off. He had earned the peace that awaited him in Houston, perhaps grilling a thick ribeye on his back porch, a cold drink in hand, listening to the crickets serenade the stars. But for now, it was just him and the open road, the steady hum of the car's engine accompanying his thoughts. The landscape stretched endlessly before him, dry cacti and scraggly bushes scattered across the dusty earth. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where even the vultures circling above seemed to have forgotten about everything below. Marcus adjusted the air conditioning, its cool relief a comfort against the heat that still clung to the air. The soft jazz of an old tune crackling through the car's stereo. He was driving at a steady 55 miles per hour, his hands firmly gripping the wheel, his mind at ease for the first time in months. But he had learned, as a Black man in America, that no road was ever truly open to him, and no matter how carefully he followed the rules, some would always see him as a threat. As the miles ticked by, Marcus noticed the sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. It was sharp and silent, with no siren to announce the presence of the officer. His stomach sank, that all too familiar sinking feeling that had accompanied his past traffic stops. He wasn't speeding, wasn't breaking any laws, but he knew from experience that this stop would not be about a broken headlight or a missed sign. It would be about something far more insidious. He eased the car onto the shoulder of the road, the tires crunching against the gravel. As he cut the engine, the radio's static faded, leaving behind only the harsh silence of the desert. The temperature still hovered around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Even with the sun gone, Marcus straightened his tie, adjusting it with the precision of someone who had spent decades facing scrutiny with dignity. He touched the FBI badge tucked in his jacket pocket. That cold reassurance that had been his armor through countless confrontations. But out here, it didn't matter. Dignity and proof were all he had against the assumptions that followed him everywhere. Like an ever-present shadow, the figure of Officer Kevin Brooks stepped out of the cruiser behind him, his tall silhouette framed against the fading light of the evening. Brooks was in his mid-40s, with a sunburned neck and a swagger in his step that screamed small-town tyrant. He didn't approach the car politely, as protocol dictated. Instead, he stood by the door and barked, "License and registration, boy," his voice dripping with contempt, the words heavy with that familiar venom that made Marcus's stomach turn. Marcus's heart clenched. It wasn't the question, it wasn't the stop, it was the assumption behind it, the automatic assumption that he was guilty, that he was less than, simply because of the color of his skin. He had faced it before, so many times, that it had almost become a reflex to remain calm, to respond with dignity. But tonight was different. Tonight, the weight of all those years of systemic racism, of being looked at as a problem simply because of who he was, seemed heavier than ever. "Can you tell me why you pulled me over, officer?" Marcus asked, His voice even. A simple question, one he was entitled to ask, but one that Brooks had no intention of answering. Instead, Brooks leaned in, his breath sour with chewing tobacco, and snapped, "You people always think you're above the law, don't you?" With a violent thud, Brooks slammed his fist onto the hood of the sedan, the metal denting beneath his knuckles. Marcus's jaw clenched, his fingers gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. But he didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. Not here. Not with Brooks's eyes narrowing in hatred. Not with that word, boy, hanging in the air like a lit fuse, ready to spark something far uglier than a simple traffic violation. The evening air grew colder as the first stars began to pierce the velvet black sky. But Marcus felt a heat rise within him. A simmering anger that threatened to break through the calm he had worked so hard to cultivate. He had been here before. He had known this feeling, this cold, ugly feeling of being reduced to something less than human, of having his dignity trampled beneath the weight of someone else's prejudice. He reached for his wallet slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible, just as he had learned to do in the past. One wrong move, one twitch of his finger, and this stop could turn into something far worse. He pulled out his driver's license, sliding it across the window toward Brooks. But he didn't stop there. His voice cut through the tense silence. Steady as steel. "I'm a federal officer. FBI. Check the badge in my glove box." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a boast. It was a simple fact. One that had ended many traffic stops for him before. With an apology and a quick retreat. But Brooks didn't even glance at the badge. Instead, he snatched the license from Marcus's hand and flicked it into the dirt outside like it was nothing more than trash. He laughed. A cold, mocking laugh. "FBI? Sure. And I'm the governor. Nice try, boy." Marcus felt the sting of those words deep in his chest. But he didn't respond. He couldn't. He had seen this before. This ugly racism wrapped in a badge. This belief that people like him didn't belong. Didn't have a right to be treated with respect. But he wasn't going to let it break him. Not tonight. Brooks leaned in closer, his sunburned face now inches from the window. He yanked open the driver's side door, the metal creaking with the force of his actions. "Get out of the car," he demanded, his eyes gleaming with something darker than just disdain. This wasn't about papers anymore. This was about power, about putting Marcus in his place. Marcus didn't argue. He stepped out of the car slowly, hands raised just enough to show he wasn't a threat. He was 6 feet 2, his broad frame towering over Brooks. But he didn't want to provoke him further. Not yet. Not unless he had to. The night stretched on, the desert silent, and in that moment, as Marcus stood there, facing down the officer, he couldn't help but feel the weight of all the years that had come before this. The countless stops. The countless moments of being treated less than. Of being forced to prove his worth in a world that didn't always see him as a man, but as a threat. But this time, he wasn't just any man. He was Marcus Johnson, the director of the FBI's Houston branch. And he wasn't going to back down. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that this stop would be the beginning of a battle far greater than anything he had ever faced before. One that would change his life, and his family's life, forever. Marcus had braced himself for a confrontation that night, but nothing could have prepared him for the chaos that followed. After his identification failed to placate Officer Brooks, the situation escalated quickly. The harsh words, the sneer in Brooks's eyes, the physical shove, it was all too familiar. But this time, it felt different. This time, the assault wasn't just on Marcus's dignity, it was a personal attack. One that threatened to unravel everything he had worked for. The helicopter swooped in, a bright beam of light cutting through the dark desert sky. Agents from the FBI were on the ground before Marcus could even take a breath. They surrounded the scene with military precision, forcing the officers to release him. Brooks and his partner, Officer Eric Simmons, were clearly rattled, but neither one seemed willing to acknowledge what had just happened. They knew they had crossed a line, but it was not a line they were willing to admit to crossing. For Marcus, it wasn't over. He knew better than to think that one helicopter could erase the years of prejudice that had shaped his life. As he climbed into the helicopter, the weight of what had just occurred settled on him like a heavy cloak. The video footage, already spreading across the internet, made him the villain. Brooks's voice, his words distorted and clipped, were now part of a viral smear campaign that painted him as the aggressor. The labels were already being attached: FBI thug, cop harasser, dangerous man. It didn't matter that he had been calm, collected, that he had done everything by the book. It didn't matter that the officers had been in the wrong. The narrative had been set. As Marcus flew to safety, his mind raced. What would happen to his career? What would happen to his family? His wife, Lena, had always been supportive, but she didn't understand the full weight of what he had to endure every single day. The subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, racism that seemed to follow him everywhere. It was only now, in the wake of this incident, that Marcus began to realize just how deeply the effects of this kind of treatment had cut into his life. His family was already under attack, with calls from news outlets, social media flooding with hateful comments, and accusations of corruption. He wasn't just a victim of an unlawful stop, now he was being targeted by a corrupt system that refused to acknowledge his worth. Lena would be the one to feel the sting first. The same system that had attacked Marcus was now coming for her. 2. The accusations of corruption were quickly turned against her as well. The public was hungry for a scapegoat, and Marcus's family seemed like the perfect target. He'd seen it before. Powerful men with money and influence would always find a way to manipulate the truth, to twist the narrative. And now, his own wife and son were being painted as criminals. Marcus didn't have time to call her yet. There was no point in trying to explain to her. Not while the storm was still raging. He knew the moment he tried to reach her, the lines would be flooded with more calls from the press. More threats, more lies. It would only make things worse. But he had to find a way to protect them, to shield them from the consequences of this deeply ingrained system of injustice. Back at the FBI headquarters, things weren't much better. The men and women who had stood by his side for years now watched the same footage. Their expressions a mixture of disbelief and confusion. The loyalty he had earned over decades in law enforcement suddenly seemed fragile. He couldn't tell who was genuinely concerned for him and who was simply waiting for him to fall. This wasn't just about his reputation, it was about their perception of him. About the narrative they had believed all these years. What would they do when the lies began to spread? It was only a matter of time before Marcus received a call from the deputy director. The message was clear: the FBI had his back. But the smear campaign was just beginning. They couldn't afford to let this go unchecked. But the system was already turning against him. It wasn't just the police officers involved, it was something much bigger. Someone had pulled the strings, orchestrated the chaos, and Marcus was caught in the middle of it. As the helicopter descended and Marcus prepared to go into hiding, a new thought emerged in his mind. This was bigger than him. This was a fight that went beyond the immediate fallout of his arrest. This was a fight for his future. For the future of the FBI. And for the future of his family. If he didn't act now, everything he had worked for, the relationships, the trust, the countless hours of service, would be destroyed by a few lies. A few misdirected punches. And this wasn't the kind of fight he was going to lose. Marcus felt the sting of betrayal deep within him. A sharp, aching wound that was harder to bear than any physical injury. The system had not just failed him, it had actively conspired against him. The doctored video, the lies circulating on the internet, and the smear campaign that had targeted his entire family, it all pointed to something far bigger than a single corrupt officer. This was the work of an unseen hand, pulling strings from the shadows, manipulating events and people like puppets on a stage. And Marcus knew that, if he didn't act, it would consume everything he had built. His career, his family, his dignity. The news of his family's arrest hit like a punch to the gut. Lena and their son Jamal were being implicated in a fabricated drug bust. Drugs, planted in their home, in their personal space, by the very people Marcus had spent his career fighting against. It was a bitter irony. For years, Marcus had dismantled criminal organizations, brought down mob bosses, and helped shut down the operations that were funded by drug money. Now, the same tactics were being used against him. His wife, his beloved Lena, was being dragged into this mess. Her life shattered by lies. Jamal, their young son, was being treated like a criminal. His innocence stolen by the power of those who believed they were above the law. But Marcus wasn't going to let them win. Not like this. The feeling of helplessness, of being trapped by a system designed to oppress him, was one he had known all too well. But he had never been one to stay down. He had faced worse. He had survived worse. This time, though, it wasn't just about him, it was about his family, his legacy, and the integrity of the entire system that had failed to protect him. With the help of trusted allies within the FBI, Marcus began to unravel the conspiracy piece by piece. He traced the connections back to local authorities, corrupt officers, shady deals, and, most disturbingly, Mayor James Carter. Carter had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes, manipulating events and people to ensure that Marcus and anyone who stood against him would fall. Carter was no stranger to power. He had been in control of El Paso for years, running a web of corruption that reached into the very heart of the system Marcus had devoted his life to serving. The deeper Marcus dug, the more he realized that the forces arrayed against him were not just local, they were systemic. This was not just a matter of one bad cop, or even one corrupt politician. It was a network, deep, tangled, and insidious. The corruption ran through the courts, the local government, and, perhaps most chilling of all, the law enforcement community itself. And Marcus had been targeted because he had been a threat to it all. He had spent years fighting against the same people who had now turned their sights on him. But Marcus wasn't about to back down. He was too close now. He had the evidence, the recorded conversations, the hacked files, and the testimonies of those who had witnessed the corruption firsthand. It was time to expose the truth. Time to bring everything out into the open. It wasn't going to be easy. Carter's grip on the city was strong, and his allies were numerous. But Marcus knew the stakes. This wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about protecting his family. About ensuring that no one else would ever have to face the kind of injustice he had. With the help of his team, Marcus planned a strategic raid on Carter's operations, aiming to take down the mayor and dismantle the network he had built. As the plan took shape, Marcus's resolve solidified. He couldn't afford to be afraid. He had no time to hesitate. This was his chance, his one shot to make things right. But just as Marcus thought he was beginning to gain some ground, a devastating twist came. The man who had always been his rock, the one person he trusted above all others, his best friend in the department, turned out to be one of Carter's men. This betrayal hit harder than anything else. Marcus had thought they were allies. But in the end, it was clear that loyalty meant nothing to men like Carter. It was all about power. And Marcus had been a fool for trusting him. But betrayal only fueled Marcus's determination. He couldn't let Carter or anyone else get away with this. His family, his life, depended on it. As he prepared for the final confrontation, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. All the years of struggle, of fighting for justice, for a better world, had led him to this moment. This was the test, the one that would define everything he stood for. And Marcus Johnson was ready. Marcus knew that every step he had taken so far had led him into uncharted territory, dangerous territory. The conspiracy that had been carefully orchestrated against him was now unraveling. But the road ahead was filled with peril. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. But the truth he was uncovering wasn't just about corrupt cops and political scheming. It was about a system that had long been rigged to protect those at the top while crushing everyone else beneath it. When Marcus received word that Lena had filed for divorce, his heart shattered. It wasn't that he didn't understand why, he did. The stress of everything they had endured had taken its toll on their marriage. The constant threat, the lies, The accusations, it had all been too much. And Marcus had been so consumed by the fight for justice, so focused on bringing down the corrupt system, that he hadn't realized how far he had pushed her away. He hadn't seen how much his obsession with the case had pulled him out of their lives. Lena wasn't just a casualty in this battle, she was a victim of a war that Marcus had unknowingly dragged her into. She had always stood by him. But this time, she couldn't. He had known the risks of his career, had understood the dangers that came with being in the FBI. But he had never imagined that the fight for justice would cost him his family. The divorce papers were like a weight in his hands. And for a moment, Marcus couldn't breathe. He had always thought that as long as he was doing the right thing, he could make everything else work. But this was different. The walls had closed in around him. He had fought to dismantle the corrupt forces that had shaped the world he lived in. But in doing so, he had destroyed the one thing that had meant the most to him. As Marcus stood there, processing the reality of the situation, he realized that no victory would ever feel sweet if it came at the cost of his family's happiness. The fight for justice was important. But so was the fight to preserve the things that made life worth living, the love of his wife, the future he had hoped to build for his son. And now, those dreams seemed like they were slipping away, lost in the rubble of the lies that had been spread about him. The moment was heavy, filled with the sharp sting of regret. He had fought for so long, had worked tirelessly to build a future, only to watch it slip through his fingers because he hadn't been present when it mattered most. In that silence, Marcus understood something profound. Justice didn't always come without sacrifice. Sometimes, the cost was greater than he had ever anticipated. But even as the weight of the situation pressed down on him, Marcus couldn't back down. He couldn't let this corruption stand. He had come too far. His family may be slipping away from him, but the fight for justice still had to be fought. For everyone else who had been wronged. For every person who had been crushed by the system. He couldn't stop now. And so, Marcus found himself at a crossroads, fighting for a justice that was, in many ways, unattainable, but also for the hope that maybe, just maybe, it would be worth it. He didn't know what the end would look like, but he knew that his path was one of conviction. If he could change the system, if he could expose the depths of corruption, maybe, just maybe, there would be a better world for his son to grow up in. But the cost, as he was learning, was staggering. In the end, Marcus Johnson's fight for justice wasn't just about dismantling a corrupt system. It was about confronting the harsh realities of the world he had long been part of. He had taken on a powerful network of criminals, politicians, and law enforcement officers who had used their positions to perpetuate a cycle of injustice. But as he had come to realize, the system wasn't just corrupt, it was built to keep people like him down. The personal sacrifices he made were steep. His career was on the line. His family, the very heart of his life, was torn apart by the chaos that surrounded him. Yet, even in the face of betrayal, violence, and heartbreaking losses, Marcus didn't back down. He kept fighting, not just for his own dignity, but for the possibility of a better future for his son. For the hope that, through his efforts, the next generation might not have to face the same systemic oppression he had endured. As Marcus finally brought down the corrupt forces, exposing the mayor and his allies, there was no celebration. Instead, the harsh reality of his sacrifices remained clear. The weight of his personal losses, his family, his peace of mind, was something he would carry with him forever. But in the end, he found a quiet strength in knowing that his fight had made a difference. Thank you for following Marcus's journey in this life story. If you were moved by his resilience and determination, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales of perseverance, sacrifice, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. Stay tuned for our next video, where we dive deep into another powerful life story. Your voice matters. Together, we can make the world a better place.